Hello, welcome back to part 2 of the first book of Famous Five, Five on Treasure Island. I'm guessing this will be the last section. I did 2 parts, which is good. So yeah. Chapter 13. Down in the Dungeons. 4 torches were flashed on to the wooden door. It was big and stout, studded with great iron nails. Julian gave a whoop of delight and rushed to it. He felt certain that behind it was a dungeon used for storing things, but the door was fast shut. No amount of pushing or pulling would open it. He had a great keyhole, but no key there. The 4 children stared at the door. Bother it. Just as they really thought they were near the ingots, this door wouldn't open. We'll fetch the axe, said Julian suddenly. We may be able to chop round the keyhole and smash the lock. That's a good idea, said George, delighted. Come on back. They left the big door and tried to get back the way they had come, but the dungeons were so big and so rambling that they lost their way. They stumbled over old broken barrels, rotting wood, empty bottles, and many other things as they tried to find their way back to the big flight of rock steps. This is sickening, said Julian at last. I simply haven't any idea at all where the entrance is. We keep on going into one dungeon after the other, and one passage after another, and they all seem to be exactly the same, dark and smelly and mysterious. Suppose we have to stay here all the rest of our lives, said Anne, gloomy. Idiot, said Dick, taking her hand. We shall soon find the way out. Hello, what's this? They all stopped. They had come to what looked like a chimney shaft of brick, stretching down the roof of the dungeon to the floor. Julian flashed a torch onto it. He was puzzled. I know what this is, said George suddenly. It's the well, of course. He remembered it was shown on the plan of the dungeons, as well as the plan on the ground floor. Well, that's the shaft of the well going down and down. I wonder if there's any opening in it, just here, so that water could be taken into the dungeons as well as up into the ground. They went to see. On the other side of the well shaft was a small opening big enough for one child at a time to put his head and shoulders through and look down. They shone their torches down and up. The well was so deep that it was still impossible to see the bottom of it. Julian dropped a stone down below, but there was no sound of either a thud or a splash. He looked upwards, and could see the faint gleam of daylight that slid round the broken slab of stone lying a little way down the shaft. The slab on which Tim had sat, waiting to be rescued. Yes, he said. This is the well, all right. Isn't it weird? Well, now we've found the well, we know that the entrance to the dungeon isn't very far off. That cheered him up tremendously. They held hands and hunted around the dark, their torches making bright beams of light here and there. Anne gave a screech of excitement. Here's the entrance. It must be, because I can see faint daylight coming down. Children rounded a corner, and sure enough, there was a steep, rocky flight of stairs leading upwards. Julian took a quick look round, so that he might know that the way to go when they came down again. He didn't feel at all certain that he would find the wooden door. They all went up into the sunshine. It was delicious to feel the warmth of their heads and shoulders after the cold air down in the dungeons. Julian looked at his watch and gave a loud exclamation. It's 6:30. 6:30. No wonder I feel hungry. You haven't had any tea. We've been working and wandering around these dungeons for hours. Well, let's have a kind of tea supper before we do anything else, said Dick. I don't feel as if I've had anything to eat for about 12 months. Well, considering you ate about twice as much as everyone else did at dinner time, began Julian. Then he grinned. I feel the same as you, he said. Come on, let's get a really good meal. George, what about boiling the kettle and making some cocoa or something? I feel cold after all that time underground. It was fun boiling the kettle on the fire with dry sticks. It was lovely to lie about in the warmth of the evening sun and munch brunch and cheese and enjoy cake and biscuits. They all enjoyed themselves thoroughly. Tim had a good meal too. He hadn't very much liked being underground, and had followed the others very closely indeed, his tail well down. He had been very frightened too, of the curious echoes here and there. Once he had barked, it had seemed to Tim as if the whole of dungeons were full of other dogs, all barking far more loudly than he could. He hadn't even dared to whine after that, but now he was happy again, eating the tidbits that the children gave him, and licking George whenever he was near her. It was past 8 o'clock by the time that the children had finished their meal and tidied up. Julian looked at the others. The sun was sinking, and the day was no longer so warm. "Well," he said, "I don't know what you feel, but I don't somehow want to go down into the dungeons again today, not even for the sake of smashing in that door with the axe and opening it. I'm tired, and I don't like the thought of losing my way in those dungeons at night." The others heartily agreed with him, especially Anne, who had secretly been dreading going down again with the night coming on. The little girl was almost asleep. She was so tired out with hard work and excitement. "Come on, Anne," said George, pulling her to her feet. "Bed for you. We'll cuddle up together in the rugs on the floor of that little room, and in the morning, when we wake, we'll be simply thrilled to think of opening that big wooden door." All four children, with Tim close behind, went off to the little stone room. They curled up on the pile of rugs, and Tim crept in with George and Anne. He lay down on them, and felt so heavy that Anne had to push him off her legs. He sat himself down on her again, and she groaned, half asleep. Tim wagged his tail and thumped it as hard against her ankles. Then George pulled him onto her own legs and lay there. Feeling him breathe, she was very happy. She was spending the night on her island. They had almost found the ingots, she was sure. She had Tim with her, actually sleeping on her rugs. Perhaps everything would come right after all, somehow. She fell asleep, and the children felt perfectly safe with Tim on guard. They slept peacefully until the morning, when Tim saw a rabbit through the broken archway leading to the little room, and sped away to chase it. He awoke George as he got up from the rugs, and sat up and rubbed her eyes. "Wake up!" she cried to the others. "Wake up, all of you! It's morning, and we're on the island." They all awoke. It was really thrilling to sit up and remember everything. Julian thought of the big wooden door at once. He would soon smash it with his axe, he felt sure. And then what would they find? They had breakfast, and ate just as much as ever. Then Julian picked up the axe they had brought, and took everyone to the flight of steps. Tim went too, wagging his tail, but not really feeling very pleased at the thought of going down into the strange places where other dogs seemed to bark, and yet were not to be found. Poor Tim would never understand echoes. They all went down underground again, and then, of course, they couldn't find the way to the wooden door. It was tiresome. "We shall lose our way all over again," said George desperately. "These dungeons are about the most raveling spread-out maze of underground caves I've ever known. We shall lose the entrance again too." Julian had a bright idea. He had a piece of white chalk in his pocket, and he took it out. He went back to the steps and marked the wall there, and then began to put chalk marks along the passages as they walked into the musty darkness. They came to the well, and Julian was pleased. "Now," he said, "whenever we come to the well, we shall at least be able to find the way back to the steps, because we can follow my chalk marks. Now, the thing is, which is the way next? We'll try and find out, and I'll put chalk marks along the walls here and there. But if we go the wrong way and have to come back, we'll rub out the marks and start again from the well another way." This was a really good idea. They did go the wrong way and had to come back, rubbing out Julian's marks. They reached the well and set off in the opposite direction, and this time they did find the wooden door. There it was, stout and sturdy, its old iron nails rusty and red. The children stared at it in delight. Julian lifted his axe. Crash! He drove it into the wood and round about the keyhole, but the wood was still strong, and the axe only went in an inch or two. Julian drove it once more. The axe hit one of the big nails and slipped a little to one side. A big splinter of wood flew out and struck poor Dick on the cheek. He gave a yell of pain. Julian jumped in alarm and turned to look at him. Dick's cheek was pure pouring with blood. "Something flew out the door and hit me," said poor Dick. "It's a splinter, or something." "Golly," said Julian, as he shone his torch onto Dick. "Can you bear it a moment if we pull the splinter out? It's a big one, and it's still sticking into your poor cheek." Dick pulled it out himself. He made a face with the pain, and then turned very white. You'd better get up into the open air for a bit, said Julian, or we'll have to bathe your cheek and stop it bleeding somehow. Anne's got a clean hanky. We'll bathe it and dab it with it. We brought some water with us too, luckily. I'll go with Dick, said Anne. You stay here with George. There's no need for all of us to go. But Julian thought he would like to see Dick safely up into the open air first, and then he could leave him with Anne while he went back to George and went on with the smashing down of the door. He handed the axe to George. You can do a bit of chopping while I'm gone, he said. It would take some time to smash the big door. You get on with it, and I'll be down in a few minutes again. We can easily find the way back to the entrance because we've only got the right to follow my chalk marks. Right, said George, and she took the axe. Poor old Dick, you do look a sight. Leaving George behind with Tim, valiantly attacking the big door, Julian took Dick and Anne up to the open air. Anne dipped her hanky into the kettle with water and dabbed Dick's cheek gently. It was bleeding very much, as cheeks do, but the wound was not really bad. Dick's colour soon came back, and he wanted to go down into the dungeon again. No, you'd better lie down on your back for a little, said Julian. I know that's good for nose bleedings, but maybe it's good for cheek bleeding too. What about Anne? What about you, Anne, going out to the rocks over there, where you can see the wreck? Staying there for half an hour or so. Come on, I'll take you both there and leave you for a bit. You'd better not get up till your cheek stops bleeding, old boy. Julian took the two out of the castle yard and out onto the rocks on the side of the island that faced the open sea. The dark hulk of the old wreck was still there on the rocks. Dick lay down on his back and stared up into the sky, hoping that his cheek would soon stop bleeding. He didn't want to miss any of the fun. Anne took his hand. She was very upset at the little accident, and although she didn't want to miss the fun either, she meant to stay with Dick till we felt better. Julian sat down beside them for a minute or two, then went back to the rocky steps and disappeared down them. He followed his chalk marks and soon came to where George was attacking the door. She had smashed it well round the lock, but it simply would not give way. Julian took the axe from her and drove it hard into the wood. After a blow or two, something seemed to happen to the lock. It came loose. He swung at it sideways, and Julian put down his axe. Think somehow that we can open the door now, he said in an excited voice. Get out of the way, Tim, old fellow. Now push, George. They both pushed, and the lock gave way. With a grating noise, the door began to open creakingly, and the two children went inside, flashing their torches in excitement. The room was not much more than a cave, hollowed out of rock, but in it something quite different from the old barrels and boxes the children had found before. At the back, in untidy piles, were curious, brick-shaped things of dull yellow-brown metal. Julian picked one up. George, he cried, the ingots! They're real gold! Oh, I know they don't look like it, but they are, all the same, George. Oh, George, there's a small fortune here in this cellar, and it's yours. We found it at last. Chapter 14. Prisoners. George couldn't say a word. She stood there, staring at the pile of ingots, holding one in her hand. She could hardly believe that these strange brick-shaped things were really gold. Her heart thumped fast. What a wonderful, marvellous find! Suddenly, Tim began to bark loudly. He stood with her back to the children, his nose towards the door, and how he barked. Shut up, Tim, said Julian. What can you hear? Is it the others coming back? He went to the door and yelled down the passage outside. Dick, Anne, is it you? Come quickly, because we found the ingots. We found them. Hurry, hurry. Tim stopped barking and began to growl. George looked puzzled. Whatever can be the matter with Tim, she said. He surely can't be growling at Dick and Anne. Then both children got the most tremendous shock, for a man's voice came booming down the dark passage, making strange echoes all around. Who is here? Who is down here? George clutched Julian in fright. Tim went on growling, all the hairs on his neck standing up straight. Do be quiet, Tim, whispered George, snapping off her torch, but Tim simply would not quite. He went on growling as if he were a small thunderstorm. The children saw a beam of powerful torchlight coming round the corner to the double dungeon passage. Then the light picked them out, and the holder of the torch came to a surprised stop. "Well, well, well," said the voice. "Look who's here. 2 children in the dungeon of my castle." "What do you mean, your castle?" cried George. "Well, my dear little girl, it is my castle, because I'm in the process of buying it," said the voice. Then another voice spoke more gruffly. "What are you doing down here? What did you mean when you shouted out Dick and Anne, and said you found ingots? What ingots?" "Don't answer," whispered Julian to George, but the echoes took his words and made them very loud in the passage. "Don't answer, don't answer." "Oh, so you won't answer," said the second man, and he stepped towards the children. Tim bared his teeth, and the man didn't seem at all frightened at him. The man went to the door and flashed his torch inside the dungeon. He gave a long whistle in surprise. "Jack, look here," he said. "You are right. The gold's here all right, and how easy to take away. All in ingots, my word. This is the most amazing thing we've ever struck." "This gold's mine," said George in fury. "This island and the castle belong to my mother, and so does anything found here. This gold was brought here, stored by my great-great-great-grandfather before his ship got wrecked. It's not yours, and never will be. As soon as I get back home I shall tell my father and mother what we've found, and then you may be sure you won't be able to buy the castle or the island. You are so very clever, finding out the map and the old box about the gold, but just not clever enough for us. We found it first." The man listened in silence to George's clear and angry voice. One of them laughed. "You're an only child," he said. "You surely don't think you can keep us from getting our way. We're going to buy this island, and everything in it, and we shall take the gold if deeds are signed. And if, by any chance, we couldn't buy the island, we'll take the gold just the same. It would be easy enough to bring a ship here and transfer the ingots from here by boat to the ship. Don't worry, we shall get what we want all right." "You will not," said George, as she stepped out of the door. "I'm going straight home now, and I'll tell my father all you've said." "My dear girl, you are not going home," said the first man, putting his hands on George and forcing her back into the dungeon. "And, by the way, unless you want me to shoot this unpleasant dog of yours, call him off, will you?" George saw, to her dismay, that the man had a shining revolver in his hand. In fright, she caught hold of Tim's collar and pulled it into her. "Be quiet, Tim," she said. "It's all right." But Tim knew quite well that it wasn't all right. Something was very wrong. He went on growling fiercely. "Now listen to me," said the man, after he had a hurried talk with his companion. "If you are going to be sensible, nothing unpleasant will happen to you. But if you want to be obedient, you will be very sorry. What were you going to do with this?" "We're going off in our motor boat, leaving you nicely locked up here. We're going to get a ship and come back for the gold. We don't think it's worthwhile buying the island now. We know where the ingots are." "And you're going to write down a note to your companions above, telling them you found the gold, and they are to come down and look for it," said the other man. "Then we shall lock all of you up in this dungeon, with the ingots too, to play with, leaving you food and drink till we come back. Now then, here's a pencil. Write a note to Dick and Anne, whoever they are, and send your dog up with it. Come on." "I won't," said George, her face furious. "I won't. You can't make me do this thing like that. I won't get poor Dick and Anne down here to made prisoners, and I won't let you have in my gold, just when I've discovered it." "We shall shoot your dog if you don't do as you're told," said the man suddenly. George's heart sank down, and she felt cold and terrified. "No, no," she said in a low, desperate voice. "Well, write the note then," said the man, offering her a pencil and paper. "Go on, I'll tell you what to say." "I can't," sobbed George. "I don't want to get Dick and Anne down here to be made prisoners." "All right, I'll shoot the dog then," said the man in a cold voice, as he levelled his revolver at poor Tim. George threw her arms round the dog and gave a scream. "No, no, I'll write the note. Don't shoot Tim, don't shoot him." The girl took the paper and pencil in a shaking hand and looked at the man. "Write this," he ordered. "Dear Dick and Anne, we found the gold. Come on down at once to see it. Then your name, then whatever it says." George wrote what the man had said. Then she signed her name, but instead of writing George, she put Georgina. She knew that the others would feel certain she would never sign herself like that, and she hoped it would warn them that something odd was up. The man took the note and fastened it to Tim's collar. The dog growled all the time, but George kept telling him not to bite. "Now, tell them to go and find your friends," said the man. "Find Dick and Anne," commanded George. "Go on, Tim, find Dick and Anne. Give them the note." Tim did not want to leave George, but there was something very urgent in her voice. He took one last look at his mistress, gave her hand a leg, and sped off down the passage. He knew the way up. Up the rocky steps he bounced and into the open air. He stopped in the old yard, sniffing. Where were Dick and Anne? He smelt their footsteps and ran off, his nose to the ground. He soon found the two children out by the rocks. Dick was feeling better now and was sitting up. His cheek had almost stopped bleeding. "Hello," he said in surprise when he saw Tim. "Here's Timothy. Why, Tim, old chap, why have you come to see us? Did you get tired of being underground in the dark? Look, Dick, he's got something twisted in his collar," said Anne, her sharp eyes seeing the paper there. "It's a note. I expect it's from the others telling us to go down. Isn't Tim clever to bring it?" Dick took the paper from Tim's collar. He undid it and read. "Dear Anne and dear Dick and Anne," he read out loud. "We found the gold. Come down at once and see it. Georgina." "Oh," said Anne, her eyes shining. "They've found it. Oh, Dick, are you well enough to come now? Let's hurry." But Dick did not get up from the rocks. He sat and stared at the note, puzzled. "What's the matter?" said Anne impatiently. "Well, don't you think it's funny that George should suddenly sign herself Georgina?" said Dick slowly. "You know how she hates being a girl and having a girl's name. You know how she will never answer if anyone calls her Georgina. And yet, in this note she signs herself by the name she hates. It does seem a bit funny to me, almost as if it's kind of a warning that there's something wrong." "Oh, don't be silly, Dick," said Anne. "What could be wrong? Do come on, Anne. I'd like to pop over to the inlet of ours to make sure there's no one else come to the island," said Dick. "You stay here." But Anne didn't want to stay there alone. She ran round the coast with Dick, telling him all the time that she thought he was very silly. But when they came to the little harbour, they saw that there was another boat there, as well as their own. It was a motor boat. Someone else was on the island. "Look," said Dick in a whisper. "There is someone else here. I bet it's the man who wants to buy the island. But they've read the old map and know there's gold here. And they've found George and Julian and want us to go down to the dungeon so they keep us all safe till they've stolen the gold. That's why they made George send us the note. But she signed it with her name she never uses, to warn us. Now, we must think hard. What are we going to do?" Chapter 15. Dick to the rescue. Dick caught hold of Anne's hand and pulled her quickly away from the cove. He was afraid that whoever had come to the island might be somewhere about and see him. The boy took Anne to the little stone room where the things were. They sat down in a corner. "Whoever has come to discover Julian and George smashing in that door, I should think," said Dick in a whisper. "I simply can't think what to do. You mustn't go down into the dungeons or we'll certainly be caught. Hello, where's Tim off to?" The dog had kept with them for a while, but now he ran off to the entrance of the dungeons. He disappeared down the steps. He meant to get back to George, for he knew she was in danger. Dick and Anne stared after him. They had felt comfortable while he was there, and now they were sorry he had gone. They really didn't know what to do. Then Anne had an idea. "I know," she said. "We'll row back to the land of our boat and get help." "I'd thought of that," said Dick gloomily. "But you know perfectly well we'd never know the way in and out of those awful rocks. It would wreck the boat." So I'm sure we're not strong enough, either, to row the way back. Oh dear, I do wish we could think of what to do." They didn't need to puzzle their brains long. The men came up to the dungeons and began to hunt for the two children. They had seen Tim, when he come back and had found the note gone. So they knew the two children had taken it, but they couldn't imagine what they had not obeyed what George had said in the note and come down in the dungeons. Dick heard their voices. He clutched hold of Anne to make her quiet. He saw through the broken archway that the men were going in the opposite direction. Anne, I know where we can hide, said the boy excitedly. Down the old well. We can climb down the ladder a little way and hide there. I'm sure no one would ever look there. Anne didn't at all want to climb down the well, even a little way. But Dick pulled her to her feet and hurried her off to the middle of the courtyard. The men were hunting around the other side of the castle. There was just time to climb. Dick slipped aside the wooden cover of the well and helped Anne down the ladder. She was very scared. The boy climbed down himself and slipped the wooden cover over against his head as best as he could. The old slab that Tim had sat on when she fell down the water was still there. Dick climbed down to it and tested it. It was immovable. It's safe for you to sit on, Anne, if you don't want to keep climbing the ladder. Clinging to the ladder, he whispered. So Anne sat shivering on the stone across the well shaft, waiting to see if they were discovered or not. They kept hearing the voices of men, now here at hand and now far off. Then the men began to shout for them. Dick, Anne, the others want you. Where are you? We've exciting news for you. Well, why don't they let Julian and George come up and tell us then? Whispered Dick. There's something wrong. I know there is. I do wish we could get to Julian and George and find out what had happened. The two men came into the courtyard. They were angry. Where have those kids got to? Said Jake. Their boat is still on the cove, so they haven't got away. They must be hiding somewhere. We can't wait all day for them. Well, let's take some food and drink down to the two we've locked up, said the other man. There's plenty in the little stone room. I suppose it's a store the children brought over. We'll leave half in the room so that the other two can have it, and we'll take their boat with us so they can't escape. Right, said Jake. The thing to do is to get the gold away as quickly as possible and make sure the children are prisoners here until we've safely got away. We won't bother any more of trying to buy the island. After all, it was the only idea of getting the ingots that put us up to the idea of getting Kieran Island and the Kieran Castle on the island. Oh, come on, said the companion. We'll take the food down now, and not bother the other kids. You stay here and see if you can spot them while I go down. Dick and Anne hardly dared to breathe when they heard all this. How they hoped that the man wouldn't think of looking down the well. They heard the old man walk to the little stone room. It was plain that he was getting food and drink to take down to the two prisoners in the dungeons below. The other man stayed in the courtyard, whistling softly. After what seemed a very long time to the hidden children, the first man came back. Then the two talked together, and at last went on to the cove. Dick heard the motorboat started up. It's safe to get out now, Anne, he said. Isn't it cold down here? I'll be glad to get out of the sunshine. They climbed out and stood warming themselves in the hot summer sunshine. They could see the motorboat streaking towards down the mainland. Well, they're gone for a moment, said Dick, and have not taken our boat, as they said. If only we could rescue George and Julian, we could get help, because George could rise back. Why can't we rescue them? Cried Anne, her eyes shining. We can go down to the steps and unbolt the door, can't we? No, we can't, said Dick. Look. Anne looked to where they pointed. She saw that the two men had piled big, heavy slabs of the broken stone over the dungeon entrance. It had taken all their strength to put the big stones there. Neither Dick nor Anne could hope to move them. It's quite impossible to get down the steps, said Dick. They've made sure we shan't do that. And you know we haven't any idea of the second entrance is. We only know if it was somewhere near the tower. Let's see if we can find it, said Anne eagerly. They set off to the tower on the right of the castle, but it was quite clear that whatever entrance there might have been once, it was gone now. The castle had fallen in very much just there, and there were piles of old broken stones everywhere, quite impossible to move. The children soon gave up the search. "Blow," said Dick. How I do hate to think the poor old Julian and George prisoners down below. We can't even help them. Oh, Anne, can't you think of something to do?" Anne sat down on a stone and thought hard. She was very worried. Then she brightened up a little and turned to Dick. "Dick, I suppose we couldn't possibly climb down the well, can we?" she asked. "You know it goes past the dungeon, and there is an opening on the dungeon floor from the well shaft. 'Cause don't you remember we were able to put our heads and shoulders and look right up to the well to the top? Could we get past Could we get past that slab, do you think? The one I just sat on just now, that had fallen across the well?" Dick thought it all over. He went to the well and peered down. "You know, I believe you are right, Anne," he said at last. "We might be able to squeeze past that slab. There's just about room. I don't know how far the iron ladder goes down, though." "Oh, Dick, do let us try," said Anne. "It's our only chance of rescuing the others." "Well," said Dick, "I'll try it, but not you, Anne. I'm not going to have you falling down that well. The ladder might be broken halfway down. Anything might happen. You must stay up here, and I'll see what I can do." "You will be careful, won't you?" said Anne anxiously. "Take a rope with you, Dick, so that you need one. You won't have to climb all the way up again." "Good idea," said Dick. He went to the little stone room and got one of the ropes they had put there. He wound it round his waist. Then he went back to Anne. "Well, here goes," he said in a cheerful voice. "Don't worry about me. I'll be all right." Anne was rather white. She was terribly afraid that Dick might fall right down to the bottom of the well. She watched him climb down the iron ladder to the slab of the stone. He tried his best to squeeze by it, but it was very difficult. At last he managed it, and after that Anne could see him no more, but she could hear him, for he quite calling up her. "Dad is still going strong, Anne. I'm all right. Can you hear me?" "Yes," shouted Anne down the well, hearing her voice echo in a funny, hollow manner. "Take care, Dick. I do hope the ladder goes all the way down." "I think it does," yelled back Dick. Then he gave a loud exclamation. "Blow! It's broken just here. Broken right off. Or else it ends. I'll have to use my rope." There was silence as Dick unwound the rope from his waist. He tied it firmly round the last but one rung of the ladder, which seemed quite strong. "I'm going down the rope now," he shouted to Anne. "Don't worry, I'm all right. Here I go." Anne couldn't hear what Dick said after that, for the well shaft made his words go crooked, and she couldn't make out what they were. But she was glad to hear him shouting, even though he didn't know what he said. She yelled at him too, hoping he could hear her. Dick slid down the rope, holding on to it with hands, knees, and feet. Glad that he was so good at gym at school. He wondered if he was anywhere near the dungeons. He seemed to have gone down a long way, but he managed to get out his torch and put it between his teeth. After he had switched it on, so that he might have both hands free for the rope. The light from the torch showed him the walls of the well around him. He didn't want to go right down to the bottom of the well. He decided that he must have just passed the opening into the dungeons. He climbed back up to the rope a little way, and to his delight saw that he was right. The opening to the dungeon was just by his head. He climbed up till he was level with it, and swung himself to one side of the well where the small opening was. He managed to get hold of the bricked edge, and then tried to scramble through the opening into the dungeon. It was difficult, but luckily Dick was not very big. He managed it at last, and stood up straight with a sigh of relief. he was in the dungeons. He could now follow the chalk marks to the room or cave where the ingots were, and where he felt sure that George and Julian were imprisoned. He shone his torch on the wall. Yes, there were the chalk marks. Good. He put his head into the wall opening and yelled to the top of the voice, "Anne, I'm in the dungeons. Watch out for that man. Don't come back." Then he began to follow the white chalk marks, his heart beating fast. After a while, he came back to the door of the storeroom. As he expected it, it's so fastened so that George and Julian couldn't get out. Big bolts had been driven home at the top and bottom, and the children inside could not possibly get out. They tried their hardest to batter down the door, but it was no good at all. They were sitting inside the store cave, feeling angry and exhausted. The man had brought them food and drink, and they had not touched it. Tim was with them, lying down with his head on his paws, half angry with George because she hadn't let him fly at the men as she had so badly wanted to. But George felt certain that Tim would be shot if he tried biting or snapping. Anyway, the other had sense enough not to come down and made prisoners too, said George. They must have known there was something funny about that note when they say I signed myself instead of George. I wonder what they are doing. They must be hiding. Tim suddenly gave a growl. He leapt up to his feet and went to the closed door, his head on one side. He had heard something, that was certain. I hope it's not these men back again already, said George. Then she looked at Tim in surprise, flashing her torch on him. He was wagging his tail. A great bang on the door made them all jump out of their skins. Then came Dick's cheerful voice. "Hi, Julian. Hi, George. Are you here?" "Woof!" barked Tim joyfully and scratched out the door. "Dim, open the door!" yelled Julian in delight. "Quick, open the door!" Chapter 16. A Plan and a Narrow Escape. Dick unbolted the door at the top of the bottom and flung it open. He rushed in and thumped George and Julian happily on the back. "Hello, how's it feel to be rescued?" "Fine," cried Julian, and Tim barked madly round them. George grinned at Dick. "Good work," she said. "What happened?" Dick told him in a few words all that happened. When he related how he climbed down the old well, and Julian and George could hardly believe their ears, Julian slipped his arm round his younger brother. "You're a brick," he said. "You're a real brick. Now, quick, what are we going to do?" "Well, if they've left us our boat, I'm going to take all of us back to the mainland as quickly as possible," said George. "I'm not playing about with men with brandished revolvers all the time. Come on." Up the well we go and find the boat. They ran to the well shaft and squeezed through the small openings one by one. Up the rope they went. As soon as they found the iron ladder, Julian made them go up one by one in case the ladder wouldn't bear the weight of all three of them. It really wasn't very long before they were all up in the open air once more, giving Anne hugs and hearing her exclaim gladly, with tears in her eyes, how pleased she was to see them all again. "Now come on," said George after a minute. "Off to the boat, quickly. Those men won't be back at any time." They rushed to the cove. There was their boat, lying. They had pulled it and reached to the waves. But what a shock for them! "They've taken the oars," said George in dismay. "The beasts! They know we can't row the boat without any oars." "They were afraid you and Anne might row off, Dick, so instead of bothering to tow the boat behind them, they just grabbed the oars. Now we're stuck. We can't possibly get away." It was a great disappointment. The children were almost ready to cry. In Dick's marvellous rescue to George and Julian, it seemed as if everything was going right, and now suddenly it was going wrong again. "We must think this out," said Julian, sitting down where he could see at once if the boat came in sight. "The men had gone off, probably to get the ship from somewhere in which they can put the ingots and sail away. They won't be back for some time, I should think, because you can't charter a ship all in a hurry, unless of course they've got one of their own." And in the meantime, we can't get off the island to get help because they've got our oars, said George. Can't even signal to any passing fishing boat because they won't be out just now. The tide's wrong. It seems as if all we've got to do now is wait here patiently till the men come back and take my gold, and we can't stop them. You know, I've got a sort of a plan coming into my head, said Julian slowly. Wait a bit, don't interrupt me, I'm thinking. The others waited in silence while Julian sat and frowned, thinking of his plan. Then he looked at the others with a smile. I believe it will work, he said. Listen, we'll wait here in patience till the men come back. What will they do? They'll drag away these stones up to the top of the dungeon entrance and go down the steps. They'll go to the storeroom where they left us, thinking we are still there, and they will go into the room. Well, what about one of us being hidden down there, ready to bolt them into the room? Then we can either go off in their motorboat or our own boat if they bring back our oars and get help. Anne thought it was a marvellous idea, but Dick and George did not look so certain. We've had to go down and bolt the doors again to make it seem as if the prisoners were still there, said George. And suppose the one who hides down there, doesn't manage to bolt the men in. It might be very difficult to do that quickly enough. They will simply catch whoever we plan to leave down there, come up to look for the rest of us. That's true, said Julian thoughtfully. Well, we'll suppose that Dick, or whoever goes down, doesn't manage to bolt them in and make them prisoners, and the men come up here again. All right. While they are down below, we'll pile big stones over the entrance just as they did. Then they won't be able to get out. What about Dick down below? Said Anne at once. I could climb up the well again, said Dick eagerly. I'll be the one to go down and hide. I'll do my best to bolt the men in the room, and if I have to escape, I'll climb up the well shaft. The men don't know about that, so even if they are not prisoners in the dungeon, they'll be prisoners underground. The children talked over the plan and decided that it was the best thing they could do. Then George said she thought it would be a good idea to have a meal. They were all half-starved, and now that the worry and excitement of being rescued was over, they were now feeling very hungry. They fetched some food from the little room and ate it in the cove, keeping a sharp look out for the return of the men. After about 2 hours, they saw a big fish and smack appear in the distance, and heard the chug 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 of the motorboat too. They are here, said Julian in excitement, and he jumped to his feet. That's a ship they mean to load with ingots and sail away in safety. And there's the motorboat bringing the men back. Quick, Dick, down the well you go, and hide until you hear them in the dungeons. Dick shut off. Julian turned to the others. We'll have to hide, he said. Now that the tide is out, we'll hide over there, behind the uncovered rocks. I don't somehow think the men will do any hunting for Dick and Anne, but they might come. Come quick. They all hid themselves behind the rocks and heard the motorboat come chugging into the tiny harbour. They could hear men calling to one another. They're surrounded. To be more than 2 men this time. Then the men left the inlet and went up to the low cliff towards the ruined castle. Julian crept behind the rocks and peeped to see what the men were doing. He felt certain they were pulling away the slab of stone that had been piled on top of the entrance to prevent Dick and Anne going down to rescue the others. George, come on, called Julian in a low tone. I think the men have gone down the steps into the dungeon now. You must go and try to put these big stones back quick. George and Julian and Anne ran softly and swiftly to the old courtyard of the castle. They saw that the stones had been pulled away from the entrance to the dungeons. The men had disappeared. They had plainly gone down the steps. The 3 children did their best to tug at the very heavy stones to drag them back, but their strength was not the same as of that of the men, and they could not manage to get any big stones across. They put 3 smaller ones, and Julian hoped the men would find them too difficult to move from below. If Dick only has managed to bolt them into that room, he said to the others. Come on, back to the well now. Dick will have to come up here, because he won't be able to get out of the entrance. They all went to the well. Dick had removed the old wooden cover, and it was lying on the ground. The children leaned over the hole of the well and waited anxiously. What was Dick doing? They could hear nothing from the well, and they longed to know what was happening. There was plenty happening down below. The two men and another had gone down into the dungeons, expecting, of course, to find Julian, George, and the dog still locked up in the storeroom with the Ingas. And the dog still locked up. So they passed the well shaft, not guessing that an excited small boy was hidden there, ready to slip out of the opening as soon as they passed. George heard them pass. He slipped out of the well opening and followed behind quietly, his feet making no sound. He could hear the beams made by the men, powerful torches, and with his heart thumping loudly, he crept along the smelly old passages between grey caves till the men turned into the wide passages where the store cave lay. Here it is, Dick heard one of the men say as he flashed his torch on the door. The gold's in there, so are the kids. The men unbolted the door at the top and the bottom. Dick was glad that he had slipped along to bolt the door, for it hadn't done that before the men had come. They would have known that Julian and George had escaped, and would have been on their guard. The men opened the door and stepped inside. The second man followed him. Dick crept as close as he dared, waiting for the third man to go in too. Then he meant to slam the door and bolt it. The first man swung his torch round and gave a loud exclamation. The children are gone! How strange! Where are they? Two of the men were now in the cave, and the third stepped in at that moment. Dick darted towards and slammed the door. It made a crash that went echoing round and round the caves and passages. Dick fumbled with the bolts, his hand trembling. They were stiff and rusty. The boys found it hard to shoot them home in the sockets, and meanwhile the men were not idle. As soon as they heard the door slam, they spun around. The third man put his shoulder on the door at once and heaved hard. Dick had just got one of the bolts almost into the socket. Then all three men forced their strength against the door, and the bolt gave way. Dick stared in horror. The door was opening. He turned and fled into the dark passage. The men flashed their torches and saw him. They went after the boy at top speed. Dick fled to the well shaft. Fortunately, the opening was on the opposite side, and he could clamber it without being seen with the light of the torches. The boy only just had time to squeeze through the shaft, and the three men came running by. Not one of them guessed that the runaway was squeezed into the well shaft they passed. Indeed, the men did not even know that there was a well there. Trembling from head to foot, Dick began to climb the rope he had left dangling from the rungs of the iron ladder. He undid it when he reached the ladder itself, for the thought that perhaps the men might discover the old well and try to climb up later. They would not be able to do that if there was no rope dangling down. The boy climbed up the ladder quickly and squeezed around the stone slab near the top. The other children were there, waiting for him. They knew at once by the look of Dick's face that he had failed in what he tried to do. They pulled him out quickly. It was no good, said Dick, panting with his climb. I couldn't do it. The burst door opened just as I was bolting it and chased me. I got into the shaft just in time. They're trying to get out of the entrance now, cried Anne suddenly. Quick, what shall we do? They'll catch us all. To the boat, shouted Julian, and took Anne's hand to help her along. Come along. It's our only chance. The men will perhaps be able to move these stones. The four children fled down the courtyard. George darted into the stone room as they passed, and caught up an axe. Dick wondered why she bothered to do that. Tim dashed along with them, barking madly. They came to the cove. Their own boat lay there without oars. Their motorboat was there too. George jumped into it and gave a yell of delight. "Here are our oars," she shouted. "Take them, Julian. I've got a job to do here. Get the boat down into the water, quick." Julian and Dick took the oars. Then they dragged their boat down into the water. Wondering what George was doing, all kinds of crashing sounds came from the motorboat. "George, George, buck up! The men are out!" suddenly yelled Julian. He had seen the three men run in to the cliff that led down to the cove. George leapt out of the motorboat and joined the others. They pushed their boat out into the water, and George took the oars at once, pulling for all she was worth. The three men ran into the motorboat. Then they paused in great dismay, for George had completely ruined it. She had chopped wildly with her axe at all the machinery she could see, and now the boat could not possibly be started. It was damaged beyond any repair, and the men make with a few tools they had. "You wicked girl!" yelled Jake, shaking his fist at George. "Wait till I get you." "I'll wait," shouted back George, her blue eyes shining dangerously. "And you can wait too. You won't be able to leave the island now." Chapter 17. The End of the Great Adventure. The three men stood at the edge of the sea, watching George pull away strongly from the shore. They could do nothing. Their boat was quite useless. The fishing smack they've got waiting out there is too big to use in that little inlet," said George, as she pulled hard at her oars. "They'll have to stay there till someone goes in with a boat. I guess they're as wild as can be." The boat had to pass fairly near to the big fishing boat. A man hailed them as they come by. "Ahoy there! Have you come from Kirin Island?" "Don't answer. Don't say a word." So no one said anything, but looked the other way, as if they hadn't heard. "Ahoy there!" yelled the man angrily. "Are you deaf? Have you come from the island?" Still the children said nothing at all, but looked away while George rowed steadily. The man on the ship gave it up and looked in a worried manner towards the island. He felt sure the children had come from there, and he knew enough of the comrade's adventures to wonder if anything was right on the island. "He may put out a boat from the smack and go see what's happening," said George. "Well, he can't do much except take the three men off, with a few ingots. I hardly think they'll dare take any of the gold, though, now we've escaped to tell our tale." Julian looked behind at the ship. He saw after a time that the little boat it carried was being lowered into the sea. "You're right," he said to George. "They're afraid something is up. They're going to rescue those three men. What a pity." Their little boat reached land. The children leapt out into the shallow water and dragged it up to the beach. Tim pulled out the rope too, wagging his tail. He loved to join in anything that the children was doing. "Shall we take Tim to Alf?" asked Dick. George shook her head. "No," she said. "We haven't any time to waste. We must go up and tell everything that's happened. I'll tie Tim to the fence in the front garden." They made their way to Kirin Cottage at top speed. Aunt Fanny was gardening there. She stared in surprise to see them hurrying children. "Why," she said, "I thought you were not coming back till tomorrow or the next day. Has anything happened? What's the matter with Dick's cheek?" Nothing much," said Dick. The others chimed in. "Aunt Fanny, where's Uncle Quentin? We have something important to tell him." "Mother, we've had such an adventure." "Aunt Fanny, we're an awful lot to tell you. We really have." Aunt Fanny looked at untidy children in amazement. "What has happened?" she said. Then she turned towards the house and called, "Quentin, Quentin, the children have something to tell you." Uncle Quentin came out, looking rather cross for his in the middle of the work. "What's the matter?" he asked. "Uncle, it's about Kirin Island," said Julian eagerly. "Those men haven't bought it yet, have they?" "Well, it's practically sold," said his uncle. "I've signed my part, and they are to sign their part tomorrow." "Why? What's that to do with you?" "Uncle, those men won't sign tomorrow," said Julian. "Do you know why they wanted to buy the island?" and the castle, not because they really wanted to build a hotel or anything like that, but because they knew the lost gold was hidden. What nonsense are you talking? Said his uncle. It isn't nonsense, father, cried George. It's all true. The map of the old castle was in the box you sold, and in the map was shown where the ingots were hidden by my great-great-grandfather. George's face looked amazed and annoyed. George's father looked amazed and annoyed. He simply didn't believe the word. But his wife saw by the solemn and serious faces of the 4 children that something important really had happened. And then Anne suddenly burst into loud sobs. The excitement had been too much for her, and she couldn't bear to think that her uncle wouldn't believe that everything was true. Aunt Fanny, it's all true, she sobbed. Uncle Quentin is horrid not to believe us. Oh, Aunt Fanny, the man had a revolver, and he made Julian and George prisoners in the dungeon, and Dick had to climb down the well to rescue them, and George had smashed up their motor to stop them escaping. Her aunt and uncle couldn't make head or tail of this, but Uncle Quentin suddenly seemed to think that the matter was serious and worth looking into. Smashed up a motorboat, he said. Whatever for? Come indoors. I shall have to hear the story from beginning to end. It seems quite unbelievable to me. They all trooped indoors. Anne sat on her aunt's knee and listened to George and Julian tell the whole story. They told it well and left nothing out. Aunt Fanny grew quite pale as she listened, especially when she heard about Dick climbing down the well. He might have been killed, she said. Oh, Dick! What a brave thing to do! Uncle Quentin listened in the utmost amazement, and had never had much liking or admiration for any children. He always thought they were noisy, tiresome, and silly. But now, as he listened to Julian's tale, he changed his mind about those 4 children at once. You've been very clever, he said, and very brave too. I'm proud of you. Yes, I'm very proud of you all. No wonder you didn't want me to sell the island, George. You knew about the ingots, but why didn't you tell me? The 4 children stared at him and didn't answer. They couldn't very well say. Well, firstly, you wouldn't have believed us. Secondly, you are bad-tempered and unjust, and we are all frightened of you. Thirdly, we didn't trust you enough to do the right thing. Why don't you answer? Said their uncle. His wife answered for them, in a gentle voice. Quentin, you scare the children, you know, and I don't expect they liked to go to you. But now they have. You will be able to take matters into your own hands. The children cannot do it any more. You must ring up the police and see what they have to say about all of this. Right, said Uncle Quentin, and he got up at once. He patted Julian on the back. You have all done well, he said. Then he ruffled George's short curly hair. And I'm proud of you too, George, he said. Oh, father, said George, going red with surprise and pleasure. She smiled at him, and he smiled back. The children noticed that he had a very nice face when he smiled. He and George were really very alike to look at. Both looked ugly when they sulked and frowned, and both were good to look at when they laughed or smiled. George's father went off to the telephone, the police, and his lawyer too. The children sat and ate biscuits and plums, telling their aunt a great many little details they had forgotten when telling the story before. As they sat there came a loud and angry bark from the front garden. George looked up. That's Tim, she said, with an anxious look at her mother. I hadn't time to take him to Alf, who keeps him with me, mother. Tim was such a comfort to us on the island, you know. I'm sorry he's barking now, but I expect he's hungry. I'll fetch him in, said her mother unexpectedly. He's quite a hero too. We must give him a good dinner. George smiled in delight. She sped out the door and went to Tim. She set him free and came and bowed in indoors, wagging his tail. He licked George's mother and cocked his ears at her. Good boy, she said, and actually patted him. I'll get you some dinner. Tim trotted out to the kitchen with her. Julian grinned at George. Well, look at that, he said. Your mother's a brick, isn't she? Yes, but I don't know what father will say when he sees Tim in the house again, said George doubtfully. Her father came back at the minute, his face grave. The police take a serious view of all this, he said, and so does my lawyer. They all agree in thinking that you children have been remarkably clever and brave, and George, my lawyer, says the ingots definitely belong to us, and they're really a lot. Father, there are hundreds, cried George, simply hundreds, all in a big pile in the dungeon. Oh, father, shall we be rich now? Yes, said her father, we shall, rich enough to give you and your mother all the things I've longed to give you for so many years and couldn't. I've worked hard enough for you, but it's not the kind of work that brings in a lot of money. So, I've become irritable and bad-tempered, but now you shall have everything you want. I don't really want anything I haven't already got, said George, but father, there is one thing I'd like more than anything else in the world, and it won't cost you a penny. You shall have it, my dear, said her father, slipping her arms around George. Much to her surprise, just say what it is, and even if it costs £100, you shall have it. Just then, there came a patting of big feet down the passage of the room they were in. Big hairy head pushed itself through the door and looked inquiringly at everyone. It was Tim, of course. Uncle Quentin stared at him in surprise. Why, isn't that Tim? He asked. Hello, Tim. Father, Tim is the thing I wanted the most in the world, said George, squeezing into her father's arms. You can't think what a friend he was to us on that island, and he wanted to fly at those men and fight them. Oh, father, I don't want any other present. I only want to keep Tim and have him here for my very own. We could afford to give him a proper kennel to sleep in now, and I'd see that he didn't disturb you. I really would. Well, of course you can have him, said her father, and Tim came right into the room at once, wagging his tail, looking for all the world as if he had understood every word that had been said. He actually licked Uncle Quentin's hand, and Anne thought that was very brave of him. Uncle Quentin was quite different now. It seemed as if a great weight had been lifted off his shoulders. They were rich now. George could go to a good school, and his wife could have all the good things he had so much wanted her to have. And he would be able to go on with the work he loved without feeling that he was not earning enough to keep his family in comfort. He beamed round at everyone, looking as jolly as a person anyone could wish for. George was overjoyed about Tim. She flung her arms round her father's neck and hugged him, a thing she had not done for a long time. He looked astonished, but very pleased. Well, well, he said, this is all very pleasant. Hello, is the police ready already? It was. They came up to the door and had a few words with Uncle Quentin. Then one stayed behind to take down the children's story in his notebook, and the others went off to get a boat to the island. The men had gone from there. The boat from this fishing smack had fetched them away, and now both ship and boat had disappeared. The motorboat was still there, quite unusable. The inspector looked at it with a grin. Fierce young lady, isn't she? Miss Georgina, he said. Done the job pretty well. No one could get away from this boat. Well, we'll have to get it towed into the harbour. The police brought back with them some of the ingots of the gold to show Uncle Quentin. They had sealed up the door to the dungeon so that no one else could get into it until the children's uncle was ready to go and fetch the gold. Everything was being done thoroughly and properly, though far too slowly for the children. They had hoped that the men would have been caught and taken to prison, and that the police would bring back the whole of the gold at once. They were all very tired that night, and didn't make any fuss at all when their aunt said they must go to bed early. They understood, and the boys went to eat their supper in the girls' bedroom. Tim was there, ready to lick up all the fallen crumbs. Well, I must say we've had a wonderful adventure, said Julian sleepily. In a way, I'm sorry it's ended, though at times I didn't enjoy it very much. Especially when you and I, George, were prisoners in that dungeon. That was awful. George was looking very happy as she nibbled her gingerbread biscuit. She grinned at Julian. And to think I hated the idea of you all coming here to stay, she said. I was going to be such a beast to you, and I was going to make you wish you were all home again. And now, the only thing that makes me sad is the idea of you going away. Which you will do, of course, when the holiday ends. And then, after having 3 friends with me, enjoying adventures like this, I'll be all on my own again. I'll never be lonely before. But I know I shall be now. No, you won't, said Anne suddenly. You can do something that will stop you being lonely ever again. What? Said George in surprise. You can go to the same boarding school as I go to, said Anne. It's such a lovely one, and we are allowed to keep our pets, so Timmy could come too. Gracious, could he really? Said George, her eyes shining. Well, I'll go then. I always said I wouldn't, but I will, because I see now how much better and happier it is to be the ones that to be with others than all by myself. And if I can have Tim, well, that's simply wonderful. You better go back to your own bedroom now, boys, said Aunt Fanny, appearing in the doorway. Look at Dick, almost dropping with sleep. Well, you should all have a pleasant dream tonight, for you've had an adventure to be proud of. George, is that Tim under your bed? Well, yes it is, Mother, said George, pretending to be surprised. Dear me, Tim, what are you doing there? Tim crawled out and went over to George's mother. He lay flat on his tummy and looked up, almost appealing out of the soft brown eyes. Do you want to sleep in the girls' room tonight? Said George's mother with a laugh. All right, just for once. Mother, yelled George, overjoyed. Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. How did you guess that I just didn't want to be parted with Tim tonight? Oh, Mother. Tim, you can sleep over the rug over there. 4 happy children snuggled down into their beds. Their wonderful adventure had come to a happy end. They had plenty of holidays still in front of them, and now that Uncle Quentin was no longer poor, he would give them the little presents he wanted to. George was going to school with Anne. She had Tim for her own again. The island and the castle still belonged to George. Everything was marvellous. I'm so glad Kieran Island wasn't sold, George said. I'm so glad it still belongs to me. It belongs to 3 other people too, said George. It belongs to me, and to you, and Julian and Dick. I've discovered that it's fun to share things. So tomorrow I'm going to draw up a deed, and whatever it's called, and put in that I give you and the other a quarter share each. Kieran Island and Castle shall belong to us all. Oh, George, how lovely, said Anne, delighted. Won't the boys be pleased? I do feel so But before she could finish, the girl was asleep. So was George. In the other room, the 2 boys slept too, dreaming of ingots and dungeons and all kind of exciting things. Only one person was awake, and that was Tim. He had one ear up and listening to the children's breathing. As soon as they knew they were all asleep, he got up quietly from his rug. He crept softly over into George's bed. He put his front paws and sniffed at the sleeping girl. Then, with a bound, he was on the bed and snuggled himself down into the crook of her legs. He gave a sigh and shut his eyes. The 4 children might be happy, but Tim was the happiest of all. Oh, Tim, murmured George, half waking up as she felt him against her. Oh, Tim, you mustn't. But you do feel so nice. Tim, we'll have other adventures together, the 5 of us, won't we? They will. But that's another story. But there we are. That's the end of the first Famous 5 book. I hope you enjoyed.